Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring and when this happens. And when will our freedom ring? And will let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city? We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing the word of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. In a portion of that speech, which I did not recite, Dr. King said, and if you just allow me to paraphrase, he said, if any of you believe that just because we've had this successful march that we're going to be satisfied, well, you've got another thing coming. You see, a civil rights bill had not been passed. Dr. King was working with President Kennedy toward the passage of some civil rights legislation. But as you know, on the 22nd day of November of that same year, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. President Lyndon Johnson, working in the memory of President Kennedy, pushed for and got the passage of the Civil Rights Bill the following summer, 1964. Dr. King and other civil rights leaders were invited to the White House to witness the signing of that bill. Another event took place the summer of 1964, a very historical event that actually took place right here on this campus. You see, Dr. King was invited to deliver the commencement address here at Springfield College on June 14, 1964. But as it would happen, Dr. King was in jail the day before. He had been arrested because he had gone to an all-white restaurant and requested service. Then President Dr. Glenn Olds was pressured to withdraw the invitation for Dr. King. In fact, it was even floated, the idea was floated that a donation of $1 million would be made during the commencement ceremonies if Dr. King was not allowed to speak. In fact, the benefactor invited Dr. Olds over to his house to discuss the issue. But President Olds held steadfast. Shaking with rage, the benefactor tore up the check in Dr. Olds' presence. But the next day, Dr. King came to Springfield College and gave a very stirring commencement address. An address which was entitled, "Remain Awake During a Strong Revolution." In that address, he talked about the story of Rip Van Winkle, who had, as you know, went up into the mountains and slept for 20 years. But Dr. King pointed out a little-known fact in that story. He pointed out the fact that when Rip was leaving the little town on the Hudson, headed up into the mountains, he passed by this inn, which had a picture of King George III of England on it. And after he came down some 20 years later, walking past this same inn, it had a picture of George Washington on it, the first president of the United States. And when he looked at George Washington, he realized that Rip realized that he was lost, that he didn't know who he was. The significant point of the Rip Van Winkle story is not that he slept for 20 years, but that he slept through a revolution. Dr. King was urging that graduating class that they too should not sleep through the revolution that was going on at that time, the civil rights movement, all the changes that were taking place in attitudes and social adjustments. Another change that Dr. King was working on that same summer was the change in voters' rights for black people. Many blacks, when they went down to vote, were often asked to pay a poll tax so that you could register to vote. A poll tax generally in the neighborhood of $10, which doesn't sound like very much money in today's dollars. But you must understand that the average daily wage, not hourly, but daily wage of a black laborer in the late 50s and early 60s was $2 to $3 per day. They were being asked to pay nearly a week's wage to register to vote. If they weren't asked to pay a poll tax, they were often given a test. And the tests were quite simple. You see, they would walk into the registered office, and the registrar would take out a jar of marbles or jelly beans and set them on the counter. And if you could tell exactly how many marbles or jelly beans are in the jar, it showed that you had the capacity to vote. There were other tests. You were sometimes asked to recite the Constitution. Knowing that that was a test, many blacks learned the Constitution and would recite it when requested. Those given a test didn't know it. They had to try to find a copy to follow along. And when you were done, they would say things like, well, you missed a word. Or if you did miss a word, they would add something. Recite the amendments. Something, anything to keep you from registering to vote. And of course, if you became a registered voter, there were other things that might happen. You were often fired from your job simply because you registered to vote. Of course, if you were fired from your job with no money coming in, if you missed a payment on an outstanding loan, whatever you pledged as collateral would be taken from you. I never will forget when my father wanted to register to vote. We owned a small farm outside of my hometown of Lake Providence, Louisiana. And I never will forget it because he called us all together to discuss it. By the way, I have 4 brothers and 6 sisters. We were the small family in our community. Yes, we were the small family. You see, on the one side, there were 12 kids in that family. And on the other side of us, there were 15 kids. I guess they raised their own labor, but anyway, we were the small family. But my dad got us all together so we could discuss this, and I still can't figure out why he did that, because whatever he decided, that was it. But anyway, we had that discussion, and I have never seen my mother so afraid. You see, our farm was mortgaged, our farm equipment was mortgaged, our farm vehicles were mortgaged. Our farmhouse was mortgaged. We even had a loan for the furniture in our house. And my dad wanted to register to vote. Well, it was decided that he would register the next day. Now, my dad had an off-farm job, as many farmers did then, and as they do today. He worked in town in a store that sold clothes and shoes. He was the first and only black salesperson in town, a town of 10,000 people. And I never will forget it because me and one of my brothers went with him because we wanted to witness this historic event for our family. Normally, when my dad went to work, he wore khaki pants, darker type pants, and a sports shirt. But this day, he wore one of his finest suits. I never will forget it because me and my brother went with him. And when he got to the store, he confronted the owner manager. His name was Quincy Stapleton. He said, Mr. Stapleton, he said, I want you to know that when it's time for my break this morning, I'm going to walk over to the courthouse and I'm going to register to vote. And he said, I need to know right now whether I should come back. And Mr. Stapleton looked at my father and he said, J.D., that's what they all call him. He said, J.D., you go on. You go on over there. You go on and you take your time. Take your time. And when you're done, well, you come on back. You come on back. Well, my dad registered to vote that day. And by the way, we still own that farm. But there were many others who lost their farm.